Okay, this is a video on how to factor trinomials by splitting the middle, or what Mrs. Jennis and I refer to as the Darth Vader method. So, I wrote down this example, 3n squared plus 14n minus 5. This is actually number 15 on page 16 in your packet. So if you want to pull out your packet and do the work there, you can, or pull out another piece of paper and you can do it along with me. That would be a good idea. So the first thing we have to do is remember to check for a GCF. Anytime we are factoring any polynomial, we always want to check for a GCF first. So 3n squared plus 14n minus 5. 3 is the smallest number there, but 3 does not go into 14. In other words, I can't do 14 divided by 3, which means my GCF there is 1. And 5, the negative 5 there, doesn't have a variable, which means there's no GCF for this example. Alright, so we can just go ahead and jump into the rest of the splitting the middle method. So the first thing we have to do is multiply our first and our last term. So we need two numbers that multiply to negative 15, but we want them to add to our middle term, which in this case is positive 14. Okay, so we can look for those numbers. If I want to multiply to a negative number, then I know that I'm going to need one factor that's positive and one factor that's negative, because that is the only way for me to get a negative m, is to have one of each. So I know that it could be 1 and negative 15. It could be negative 1 and positive 15. So I need to decide which one it is. There are other factors of negative 15, but I know that I want 14, so I'm kind of thinking it's got to be one of these. I want a positive 14, which means negative 1 and positive 15. So what we are going to do is we are going to go back to our original problem, and we are going to bring down the first term, which is 3n squared. Bring down the last term, which is negative 5, and we are going to split the middle term. And we are going to split it into whichever two numbers we picked here. So that would be a minus 1n and a plus 15n. We do have to remember to put the variable with both of them, because we're not splitting a 14, we're splitting a 14n. So we do have to make sure that both of them have a variable along with it. Okay, and now we are going to do what you guys have been doing for a couple of weeks now, and we are going to factor by grouping, because there are 4 terms. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we group our first 2 terms together and our second 2 terms together, and we look for the GCF. So the GCF between 3n squared and negative 1n would be n. If we factor that out, we're left with 3n minus 1. And the GCF between 15n and negative 5 would be 5. So I'm going to put that out front, and I'm left with 3n minus 1. And when we get to this point, if what's inside the parentheses matches, we know we're on the right track. If those don't match, we have a problem. So those match, which means I'm going to take it and write it once, 3n minus 1. And essentially, I'm factoring that out. So I want the leftovers, which in this case is n plus 5, and those are going to go in the other set of parentheses. There was no GCF that I factored out in the beginning, which means this is my final answer. 3n minus 1 times n plus 5. Okay, so we are going to look at another example. And I want one, let's do number 16 on page 16. So this one is I'm going to change it to x's. So 2x squared minus 6x minus 80. And again, we need to check for a GCF first. Well, when we look at that, we can see that they all have a factor of 2 because they are all even. So factor out that GCF, and we're left with x squared minus 3x minus 40. Well, now the nice part about taking that GCF out is now my numbers are much smaller. I don't have to multiply to 160 and add to negative 6. I can multiply to negative 40 and add to negative 3. That's much easier. So I'm going to focus on this x squared minus 3x minus 40. This 2 will come back into play in a little bit. So multiply your first and your last term. And we know that we need two numbers that multiply to negative 40. And we want to add to our middle term, which is negative 3. So again, we're multiplying to a negative number, which means just like up top, we're going to want one factor that's positive and one factor that's negative. So when you write out your factors, I don't want to put 1 times 40 because that's not negative 40. I need to make one of those negative. Okay? So then we could do negative 2 and 20. It's not divisible by 3, but it is divisible by 4 and 10. And it could also be negative 5 and 8. Well, I know I can switch the negatives around on all of those. Negative 5 plus 8 would give me a positive 3, which means I've got the right number but the wrong sign. So I'm going to make it a positive 5 and a negative 8. And if I add those together, that gets me my negative 3 that I want. So I'm going to go back to my original one over here. And I'm going to bring down the x squared and bring down the negative 40, and I'm going to split the middle. So this negative 3x is actually going to become a plus 5x minus 8x. And if we look, we're not changing the problem here at all. It's still x squared. If I put these together, that's my negative 3x, and then the negative 40. Nothing about this changed except the way that it looks. But now I've got 4 terms, and I can factor by grouping. So group your terms together. The GCF here would be x, so I take that out, and I'm left with x plus 5. And I have a GCF here of negative 8, and it needs to be negative because my leading coefficient is negative. And I'm left with x plus 5. And when I look, x plus 5, those matched, so I'm going to take it and write it once. And I'm going to take my leftovers, which is x minus 8, and put those into a binomial. And then I have to remember to go back to the very, very original, and I factored out a GCF of 2. So I'm going to take that and put it into the front. So my answer is 2 times x plus 5 times x minus 8. That is our final answer for that problem. Alright, if you need to rewatch the video, you can go ahead and do that. Try some practice problems on your own. You guys have some examples on Google Classroom that you can use to practice and then check your answers. And I will see you guys later. Okay, bye!